So what does a country or a government do when it's trying to get itself out of a downturn? And that's almost the situation everywhere, isn't it, right now? Because no country really has come out of the, first of all, the global financial crisis more than 10 years ago. But also, they haven't really recovered from the pandemic either. Everyone is trying. They spent a lot of money, of course, during the pandemic, and a lot of governments are trying to recoup their losses, so to speak, on that, which is perhaps making the situation worse. But Steve, the way really, we'll talk about the importance of government money. And of course, it's a very old Keynesian idea, isn't it? The government spends its way out of a depression or a recession or just a downturn in spending, get the government to jolly it up. But really, ultimately, you want the private sector to work, don't you? You want people to be, there's two ultimate reasons why, there'll be more, but the way I say it, the two main reasons are, people aren't borrowing or businesses aren't borrowing to expand. So you've just got this fear of spending in the private sector, and you want that to change. So businesses invest and they grow as a result of that. And that adds to the money supply because they're borrowing from banks. And you want consumers' confidence. So you can have all the money in the world, but if consumers aren't feeling confident about the economy, then the whole, save it for a rainy day syndrome kicks in. So you need to provide that confidence. So borrowing and confidence, irrespective of where the money's coming from, they're the key ingredients, aren't they?
They're the key ingredients, and money plays an essential role in generating those key ingredients. And this is one reason that neoclassical economists can't understand Keynes's original idea, because they don't have money or debt or banks in their models. So they're not even equipped to simulate what might happen if you have an increase in the money supply. It's not even in their macroeconomic thinking. And this is why they can't understand Keynes. They never did understand Keynes. If you go back to the 1930s, when Keynes published the general theory of employment, interest, and money, they just, how does money matter? They don't even know. Okay, so they left it out of their thinking. But the basic idea is that government money creation, which is then spent, most of it is spent, provides a counter to a downturn in money spending coming out of the private sector. And it's in the classical old way it was put, first of all, by Keynes, it is what we call a counter-cyclical policy. Intriguingly, I've built a set of models of macroeconomy working straight from what I call first principles, which are definitions. And the very first model has the wages share of GDP, which also gives you the capitalist share of GDP, and the employment rate. That gives you a cyclical economy when you first put it together. The second one includes private debt. And the intriguing thing about that, and this is what I published in my paper on modelling Minsky's financial instability hypothesis back in the 1990s, is that you can reach stability, you can reach a long-term equilibrium, but more likely what you're going to have is a rising level of private debt to GDP, which causes a boom initially and seems to stabilise the economy, and then you have a crash. And then the fourth thing I added was government spending. You had government net spending in excess of taxation. And that I link that to the employment rate. So the higher the level of employment, the lower the government level of spending was. And that model has been tested by some mathematicians, Matthias Cresselli and Bernard Costelima, from a mathematical point of view of what's known as persistence theory, which is actually applied to biology. What dynamics are going to make sure that every species in an ecosystem survives? And they looked at it and said, in the case of without the government spending, you almost inevitably end up in what they called the bad equilibrium, where you had zero employment, zero wages, and infinite ratio of private debt to GDP. That's a debt deflation. When they added in the government sector, they said that even with a mild level of government reaction to a rise in unemployment, you avoided that crisis. So the system remained in a world where you had positive employment, positive wages share, and less than an infinite private debt ratio. So in a mathematical sense, that confirms Keynes's argument. A private sector economy needs government spending as a counter to what can happen when too much private debt is taken on by firms.
But was Keynes a modern monetary theorist in that case? Did he actually believe that government spending was adding to the money supply? And I want to investigate that a bit more as to how much is actually added. Or was he just pure and simple saying, well, look, if the private sector is not spending, the government needs to spend, irrespective of whether it tries to make it up later. Someone's got to spend. If it's not the private sector, then it's the government. I mean, was he actually also arguing that government spending is adding to the money supply?
Not in the general theory. I mean, I have to confess I haven't read his treatise on money. There's a couple of holes in my reading, but that's one. Another is Adam Smith's moral sentiments, and I've never slogged all the way through Marshall.
I'm assuming he doesn't, because the MMT advocates would be all over it, wouldn't they? And we'd be quoting him left, right, and centre, and that's not happening.
In a sense, they are, because modern monetary theory was first put forward by Warren Mosler on a discussion list called the PKT, Post-Keynesian Thought, back in the 1990s. And of course, everybody on PKT was a post-Keynesian. And by post, we don't mean after Keynes. I had an idiot of a university student who thought Samuelson was post-Keynesian because Samuelson wrote in 48 and Keynes wrote in 36. I basically had to kick that kid out of my course. But the basic point of post-Keynesian is we say we understood what Keynes tried to say, which the mainstream didn't, and we then continue on his ideas. So in that sense, modern monetary theory was accepted by post-Keynesians, and it's a parallel approach, focusing specifically on the role of the government in creating additional money, and through that creation of money, stimulating demand as well.
So, by the way, checking him off the course is a bit severe, isn't it? I mean, he was there to learn, Steve. There you are. He needed correcting. Yeah, and you just get rid of him. That's very dictatorial of you.
I did make one stuff up in his exam question. I've got to confess, this particular kid. But he was just on stage and he said, this is post-Keynesian economics, and he starts reading Samuelson. And I had to interrupt him and said, excuse me, Samuelson is not post-Keynesian. Oh, yes, he is. He's wrote in 48. He's therefore after. And I went on, and I finally said, look, I'm sorry, shut up, sit down, get out of the way. You're just wasting everybody else's time. And finally, I mean, a few more events like that, and I said, look, you just don't belong in this course. He was absolutely convinced. He could not be persuaded by a professor that he was wrong about what was post-Keynesian versus Keynesian. Right. So my didactic side came out.
Right, okay, let's not character assassinate this guy, because he's not here. But the idea of money being added to the economy, though, to help it grow, I mean, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? At the very simplistic level, the level at which my mind operates, I can't spend any more money if I haven't got any more money. So there's only one way I can get more money, which is either I earn more, which means someone else is earning less because the companies I'm working for only have so much money, or I pay less tax to the government, which means the government therefore runs into more of a deficit. That's the only way I can actually
or you can borrow money from a bank. Okay.
Or I can borrow money from a bank.
But when you borrow money from a bank,
ultimately I have to pay that back. So
that's right.
In the long run, I can't do that.
Yeah, you can do it. I mean, people are willing to go into debt, even though when you go into debt, it means you're getting borrow $100,000, you got $100,000 in debt. Why do you do it? Because you can't buy the house you want to buy with warm intentions. You need the cash. You take on the debt as a necessary.
It's to bring my quality of life forward, isn't it? So even though I have to pay it back, but that gets back to the whole point, the earlier point, that I won't borrow if I'm not confident that I'm going to keep my job, for example. So you've got to have that confidence.
And what you see when you look at the statistics, there's a negative relationship between credit, which is the increase in private debt, and the unemployment rate. So if credit is rising, then unemployment falls, and it's ridiculous how strong that correlation is. When I take it between 1990 and 2015 for American data, the correlation is minus 0.92. Basically saying credit up, unemployment down. But of course, when you've got credit up, unemployment down, the credit adds to the level of private debt. And you can then get to the point that people can no longer service that debt. They might borrow for euphoric projects. They might be speculating rather than investing, which generates returns for the speculator, but it doesn't change the capacity of the economy to service that debt. So you finally have a crash like we saw in 1929. We saw again in 2007. And when that crash occurs, you go from positive credit to negative credit, and the negative credit means rising unemployment. Now, when you look at the relationship between government spending, the deficit, and the employment rate, it's actually a positive correlation. The relationship, looking again at that same period of data, the employment rate the unemployment rate and the government spending both rise in the same direction. So government spending goes up, unemployment goes up. Now, the question has to be, does government spending cause unemployment, or does unemployment cause government spending? And the basic logic is unemployment causes government spending, because when there's a decline in employment, that means there are less people earning a job, having a job, earning a wage. There's higher unemployment benefits. There's lower tax receipts. That rising unemployment normally goes with a collapse in profits as well. So in that situation, the unemployment rate causes a whole lot of spending, which is locked in by the government. The government has commitments for unemployment. They always try to get out of those, of course, but they've also got tax revenue. And if there's a decline in the private sector activity, then the tax revenue falls, and therefore the deficit rises as well.
So this gets back to, when you and I first started speaking, however many years ago that was, a couple of decades ago.
I think it was 1912, wasn't it?
It's something like that, yeah. I think it was, between the wars, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's between the wars.
It was a bit later than that.
Between Crimean and First War. Let's get that
and the First War. That's what it was. Yeah, exactly. But when we first started talking, what we were talking about, your big thing, which is, has been consistent through everything, although we've a more intricate path, but it was all about private debt and how it was growing too far, and those liabilities that people have. It was all just going to come tumbling down, which we saw during the global financial crisis. But I mean, it is if you look at the fastest way of putting money into the economy, is it the government spending more, increasing its deficit, or is it actually encouraging people to borrow more? I think most economists would say, well, it's encouraging people to borrow more. It's going to be the fastest way, because you could go and get a mortgage for $1 million, and that's 80, and borrow 80% of it.
Except
you're not going to have that much of a deficit per person coming from the government.
But except that the mainstream also thinks that people borrow money doesn't create money. If you look at the model that dominates, I'm so sick of. In some ways, if I could go back,
do you reckon that's? I mean, I talked to a lot of economists. Sorry, I interrupted. By the way, a lot of people get complaining about us interrupting you on this video.
No. I leave a long pause and you hop in.
Exactly, that's right. You take your glasses off. That's always the mark for me. I'll jump in now. No, it's a mark of disrespect. Somebody said that how can someone of a lesser intellect, they're talking about me.
You got a big mouth, but that's the balance. You do call yourself Loudmouth Communications.
That's the name of my company. But they think I'm being rude to you. Can you just put them on? I'm not being rude to you. We are the best of friends.
We're a couple of mates having a rave over a beer, and the only trouble is we're not in a pub, and we're 15,000 kilometres apart right now. But it's basically mates having a rave over an issue.
Yeah.
And
we wouldn't want to do it over a beer, because we'd look like Nigel Farage. He's ruined beer for me.
I'll go for wine. Go for wine. Yeah, I'll push myself.
Exactly. That's more our scene. Exactly. Absolutely. Definitely. Do you know, through all of this, I've forgotten what we were talking about now.
Oh,
it was the idea that yes, you can drive debt faster by you can drive the money supply faster by private sector debt.
And the funny thing is, when you look at the models that the neoclassicals use about banking, they have two models. One is what they call the money multiplier. Now that only works in their heads if the government spends in the first place, because the idea is, this poor bank manager is constrained by the required reserve ratio, doesn't have enough money, and this powerful dole recipient walks in and slaps $100 on the teller table and says, please put this in my account, and suddenly that $100 is now available to be lent out again and again and again, and ultimately get $1,000 out of it. That's their model of money creation. But their model of lending, they call it loanable funds. And in loanable funds, you, as a person who's got a bank account at a bank, lends to me, as a person who's got a bank account at a bank. Yours going down, mine goes up. There is no creation of money. So the ironic thing is, even during the global financial crisis, when these idiots like Ben Bernanke were caught completely by surprise by the financial crisis, their response was, we need to get lending happening again. Now, they weren't even looking at the level of private debt. And they didn't realise that private debt in America had gone from 50% of GDP to 170% of GDP. And in fact, there was too much private debt causing the trouble. Their only solution was create more private debt. So it's ignorant. And that's what, you can tell I'm pretty pissed off these days. I had too much of this stuff for too long.
Right, but I think most economists, this is the point I was going to make before we got
Yeah.
off track.
Ah.
Because as you know, I talk to economists in a bank,
Mm.
and banks know what they do. They know how they're lending out money. I mean, I think there's this acknowledgement. You don't think so? Well,
No.
but I think, well, it depends on, how close you are to
Well,
the coalface, I guess. But I
oh,
mean,
the closer to the
there are
coalface,
some,
yeah.
well,
I'm going to
if you're
interrupt
at the
you now.
coalface,
The closer you
yeah,
are to the coalface, you more see
that's so rude,
the more.
so
I know. I think
disrespectful.
it's indeed. It is. Your T-shirt just calls for disrespect, mate. The closer you are to the coalface, the more you see black rather than necessarily the
Mm,
forces that created
mm,
the coal. And
like
that's what I find with a lot of bankers. I remember having big arguments with a student of mine who was then working for ex-student of mine working for I think NAB, and he was saying, "Look, we borrow money before we lend. We can't lend unless we
mm,
borrow money beforehand." He said, "We borrow all this American dollar stuff. We borrow on the international markets all the time." And I said, "Do you lend out American dollars?" He said, "No." And I said, "Well, what are you doing?" And what it turns out with the way accounting treats long-term debt, if you take out long-term debt, that's counted as part of your equity. Okay. And with a higher level of equity, you can therefore do more loans. It's not that you're lending the dollars, you get an increase in your equity base. It means your leverage ratio between your equity and your deposits and loans becomes lower, and therefore you've got more room to lend. And then also, if you're running a trade deficit, which Australia's almost always done, you can then sell those dollars back to potential customers for their shopping overseas. So you win out of that. But most bankers don't understand banking. They understand
mm.
individual transactions. They're brainwashed by doing an economics degree somewhere. They think they're lending on somebody else's money.
Yeah, I think a lot don't though. I think I think I'd even say the majority working within banks recognise that they are creating the loan, and the issue is the serviceability of that debt. That is the factor that they are most
Okay.
concerned about. If we
Okay.
create this money and give
You
it to
talk
you,
to them more
I
often than I do, so I'll concede that one.
yeah. But
I'll
I
have a
mean,
glass
but
of
I
wine
take
to
your
make
point.
up for a mistake.
But I take your point that the majority. But anyway, either side, on the other side, let's look at. So that's the way a chunk of money is created, and
Yeah.
the issue is that if people borrow too much, then can they service it, and do we get to the situation where you start to get the sort of crunch that we've seen several times
Mm.
in our lifetime, where they've just borrowed too much, and you don't get that issue supposedly with government debt, but with government debt we do have the problem that we think that you've got to pay it back, and
That's
that creates the problem when you've got people like the UK Chancellor who's there saying we now have to spend less because we spent more back then.
Yep.
And so you get less government spending, whether it's increasing the money supply or not. They're just spending less in the economy, so the economy has a slowdown.
Exactly. And that's what's so frustrating to watch this stuff happening all the time because economic textbook myths affect people, how people actually behave in the real world. And it's the opposite of the real world situation. You should worry about private debt. Government debt is simply a record of how much fiat money has been created over time, which is one of the points that modern monetary theory makes. So if you do have a downturn, then the Keynes's argument was that you stimulate the lack of aggregate demand by creating more aggregate demand by the bank, by the government, and without necessarily having the monetary component of that in the general theory. And I've got to read the Treatise on Money. I haven't done that, so Keynes may have said it there. But fundamentally, I think it was an aggregate demand argument he made rather than a money supply creation argument. What modern monetary theory has got right, and of course I think it's got a lot of stuff wrong as well, what it's got right is that when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it creates fiat money. And then that is spent by the public. One difference with private money, if you borrow, no, you're a bit strange. So maybe you do borrow for the sheer pleasure of being in debt. Okay. But of course not. Okay. Nobody borrows for the pleasure of being in debt. You borrow because you want to spend it. So if you have credit created money, virtually all of it goes fairly rapidly into aggregate demand. You borrow the money, you spend it on a commodity, you buy an asset like a house, et cetera, et cetera. So you can
I'm
actually have
building an extension for me at the moment.
that's the
But
one.
yeah,
Yeah,
so,
yeah. So you have a one-for-one relationship between the change in private debt and the change in aggregate demand. That's something I mathematically proved back in 2016 or 17 after a debate with some fellow post-Keynesians in the Journal of the review of Keynesian economics. But when it comes to government spending, if the government spends, it puts money in your bank account and it doesn't put debt against you at the same time. So the increase in money, if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it puts more money into private bank accounts than it takes out. That's the one entry on the liability side of the banking sector. And basically, the bank liabilities are the money supply. That's our deposit accounts are their liabilities. So deposit accounts go up. The balancing item on the other side is reserves, what we properly called settlement accounts. And that's where the asset, so the assets of the bank rise just as they do with making a loan, but the asset is reserves, which is not a debt of the people who receive the money. So when you get money from government spending, you can hang on to it or you can spend it, one or the other. Okay. So what I found when I did a mathematical model of that, I had to have a savings propensity, 1 minus S. So what Keynes actually had in the general theory was to say that consumption is a function of the level of income, and he had people. Consumption and savings were the two ways you could handle any money injection you got, and he had savings being S times little s times Y, which is GDP, and consumption being 1 minus S times little y. So you can actually save some of the money the government gives to you because there's no debt attached to it for you. So government spending in that sense is not as effective as credit in boosting demand. Okay, but it's more effective in that it gives you the private sector gets money with no liability attached to it. So you increase the net worth of the private sector. And if you do that sufficiently, but not too much, people feel more comfortable about spending because they've got a buffer. The government's created the buffer for them. So that's
Right, I want to go through a fictional practical example, if that's not a contradiction of terms, when we come back after the break. But just going into all of this, just a final question to go to the break with. All of this, we're saying that the growth of an economy is dependent on the amount of money that sits in that economy, the amount of money that's there to spend. Isn't that all a bit quantity theory of money? Isn't that all a bit shock horror, Milton Friedman?
The quantity theory of money was not a theory of money. This is when you read Milton Friedman's stuff. He had a mechanical relationship between money supply and demand, but in what his paper called the optimal quantity of money, which is where there's garbage about helicopter money first turned up and the phrase helicopter money, he assumed there was a fixed capital stock, no capacity to invest, no capacity to change the level of physical output. Now that's garbage. Okay, a lot of when people borrow money or with the impact of government spending is you'll use that to invest and therefore change the productive capability of the economy. So that stuff, this is real world stuff. We need to rescue a lot of interesting ideas from Milton Friedman, and one of them is that money has a large role in determining the level of aggregate demand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I talked to one investor who said basically he looks at around the world at the changes in money supply and maps that to growth and invests accordingly. And he says he does quite well out of it.
Richard Vague made a similar point when I published the chapter on money. Richard's one of my great supporters, and somebody also does brilliant work himself on the history of money and history of debt. So ignore the name. Richard Vague is the least vague person I've ever known. Brilliant businessman and a fantastic intellectual in his own right. And he's been through the history of booms and busts and stuff like that. And when I wrote it, he said he puts three things together to work out what the level of rate of change of aggregate demand in an economy is going to be. The level of credit, the government deficit, and the trade surplus. Okay. He says the three factors together determine the level of increase in money.
Give me those three again, sorry.
Okay. The government deficit creates money. Credit, which is an increase in money supply, matched also by identical increase in private debt, and then the trade surplus. If you have more exports than imports, increase in the money supply. And he uses that to map the potential performance of different economies around the world. And, I know they've got a fight over this at the moment with modern monetary theory. I'll back Richard any day against that stuff.
Yeah, because they'd argue over the last one and be okay with the first two. Yeah. Okay, look, a practical example. I want to look at a country that's changing its spending and the implications of all of that when we come back. But it's all been good so far, and I've not
Well,
interrupted too much. I've been very polite to you, I think,
I've been rude
basically.
to you. It's a
Yeah,
balancing item.
exactly. Yeah.
We need to have you. I obviously had a rudeness deficit, so I've got to catch up.
Yeah, that's right. It all balances out in the end.
It
Well,
does.
maybe not. We'll see. We'll be back in a second on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, welcome back, Steve. We are looking at how governments can get themselves out of a financial crisis, or at least a slump in spending. And we've talked about how it could be the encouraging people to borrow, but there's a danger that you can go too far with that if you start to get a debt that's just unserviceable.
Yeah.
You don't have that issue if the government spends. It's basically what we've said so far. So let's look at a practical example of all of this. Let's say an economy spends $3 trillion, say. Actually, let's not call it dollars, because this is a fictional country. So I've created a currency called the plonk, which is quite the plonk. Yeah.
Okay.
The people who use it are the plonkers, and in Plonkland, I guess. So anyway, 3 trillion plonk is being spent by the government, but the government is spending half of that money on health. And it goes, let's say it's $1 trillion plonk it's spending on health. And it's going, we're spending a lot on health. Why don't we just privatize our health service? And therefore, we don't have to spend that $1 trillion. So we are now just $2 trillion in deficit. They don't have any tax, by the way. So their 3 trillion is 3 trillion is all a deficit. They're very happy, these plonkers. But now they've been told they've got to pay for their own health service. So all of a sudden, the government deficit's gone down from 2 trillion, and people that were spent that trillion that's running the health service is now being spent by the people of Plonk. So these plonkers, all of a sudden, are spending money on stuff that they didn't have to spend before, which means that the money that they used to spend on other stuff, going out to the theatre, whatever it might be, adding to their houses, all of that they're not spending now because they are spending on our health. So has the money supply changed there at all?
The rate of growth of the money supply has changed because the deficit creates money. Okay, if the government spends more than it takes in taxation, it puts more money into people's bank accounts than it takes out by taxation. That is a change in the money supply. So when you look at the rate of change of the money supply, in that case, government spending minus taxation. And then you add in credit and you add in the export surplus as well. This actually turns up in the definition of GDP. Okay, they're all included in GDP. So that decision to have a smaller deficit is a decision to create less money. And therefore if money has any relationship with real output, which of course it does in the real world, not in economics textbooks, but then again, you might as well have Cinderella and a big Red Riding Hood at economics textbooks. You'd probably learn more. This reduction in the deficit reduces the rate of growth of the money supply. And as you say as well, it means that people used to have public services provided effectively almost for free for them. Suddenly they've got to pay for it. Well, they spend less than the real economy, the non-government economy, and that means a slowdown in general there as well.
Yeah. So that it's that trillion, isn't it? It's that trillion of deficit that they've reduced is in effect a trillion less being spent in the economy. Is it a trillion less in money being added?
Yeah, fundamentally, that's if the government's you've got a $3 trillion plonk there. So let's say the plonk's plonked down, 4 trillion in taxation and 7 trillion in spending, then you've got that 3 trillion, which is the creation of money per year by the deficit. If that goes down to 2 trillion per year, then you've got, effectively a 33% fall in the rate of growth of the fiat component of the money supply. And then the response that people make to that, and we've seen this happen historically, particularly in American data, it's very, very strong there. When the government spends less, it forces the private sector to maintain its spending momentum to go and borrow from the private banks. And almost without fail, when the government has tried to cut its debt, the private sector has increased its. And it works for a while because what people normally do is they buy non-financial assets with that money. So the government's spending less, things are tight, your own budget contracts. Therefore, people think, oh, I better buy an asset which might rise in price, go and might borrow money from a bank, buy a house, buy an investment property, buy shares, hope the prices will rise, and you get a speculative bubble coming out of it, which ultimately bursts. And that was what happened. Of course, we know in the global financial crisis, it was all lending with ninja loans to mortgages. And when people are treating their houses as ATMs and taking out money of the notional capital gain that it had from the marketplace, that added to aggregate demand. Then when it all came crashing down, you had the first negative credit event in America's history since World War II. So looking at the rate of change of private debt, that was positive all the way from 1945 until 2008. And then you had the downturn negative. Same thing for the Great Depression. In the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, the American president at the time, ran a 1% of GDP surplus every year, was proud of it, bragged about it, said it had to be continued. It was the cause of prosperity. In the meantime, he didn't notice the private sector was borrowing 5% of GDP more every year. You had a private debt bubble that financed both a real estate bubble, and this is something which Richard Vague's own research pointed out to me. The 1920s began with a real estate bubble, and then that transferred across to the stock market bubble. People borrowed huge amounts of money to buy shares on margin. Then the market crashed, and they went from positive credit of roughly about 8% of GDP to negative of minus 10% of GDP. And then the previous one before that was what they call the Panic of 1837. So rising private debt followed by a credit crunch has almost been the recipe when the government tries to reduce its deficit.
It's that old animal instincts, isn't it? This idea. I mean, how stupid would you have to be to think that, yeah, the share market keeps on going up and therefore it always will. Therefore, I'll borrow to invest. And yet people make that mistake time and time again in history. But you talked about this change in government deficits. It's the rate of change that counts, doesn't it? So if you've got an extra trillion plonk, or one less trillion plonk, sorry, which is now being pushed out into the public sector because the government is spending less. That's that year. I mean, the actual amount, the deficit could be hundreds of trillions of plonk.
You mean the accumulated debt level? You mean the accumulated government bond sales?
So you might be adding to the money supply, but you might be adding only 0.5% to the money supply, for example. In which case, is it really going to make that much difference?
Well, it's more the impact. Like when you what GDP is output per year. Okay, okay. So that is driven by turnover of money per year. Okay. Now, if you have an economy which is growing, and we're now finding what the dangers are of a continually growing economy on a finite planet. But, again, you're living up the climate change issue yet again. When that economy is growing in physical output, it needs an increase in money supply as well to bring that about. Because when you look at what actually happens, we live in a monetary world. We talk about the real economy, but when you look at how we put together the real rate of GDP growth, which is the obsession of all societies, you are taking real numbers which are based on actual money sales, and then working out a price deflator to work out what the so-called real increase is. But the real numbers are the ones with the actual money value inside them. Now, if the money value is falling or not growing as fast, there's not an economy on the planet that has had real physical economic growth while having a falling money supply, because we are actually transacting in money. So therefore, if you're going to have the sort of rate of economic growth we've taken for granted for the last 250 years, basically 2 or 3% per annum in real terms, then you need to have an increase in the money supply of a similar amount, plus normally a larger amount, which explains where not inflation comes from, but explains why you don't experience deflation.
And of course, all of this is, as you say, covered in the equation for measuring GDP. Government spending is counted as part of it.
And if you believe that X minus M, they've got the same sign. And this is why I'm finding it so frustrating dealing with modern monetary addicts. these days because they're actually denying what you can find in the basic definition of the macroeconomy. X minus M has the same sign as G minus T. Okay, if G minus T creates money, X minus M creates money, but they're denying the latter point.
Right. My point is though that if you say, well, okay, GDP is growing, and all economists say, we want to see that happen. If that is being driven by a chunk of it is being driven by government spending. So if private sector spending is low and your exports are low, for example, then you really need that government spending to rack up quite a lot to try and see that growth in GDP. It's there in the equation. Then and all economists accept that and say, well, it's great to have growth. Are they looking at that and saying, oh, yes, it's great to have growth, but if it's being driven by increased government spending, then that's a false GDP because we're going to have to pay it back later? I don't hear them making that argument too much when they see those numbers.
That's pretty much the Austrian economists have that attitude. They actually define inflation as increase in the money supply. And I've got to laugh at it because the way inflation is defined is a change in the price index. Change in the prices of things. They say no, inflation is the money supply. So instantly they're anti-increase in the money supply. But at the same time, they don't understand how private banks create money. So they're anti one. They know half the equation and they're anti the entire equation without understanding it. So.
Right, but it is a balancing act with inflation, obviously.
Yeah,
increase the money supply.
It's fascinating to look at the long-term data on this because the Bank of England has put together a very nice database of back to as far as 1100 for various things like wheat prices and things of that nature, back to 1600 for a large amount of monetary measures. And the inflation rate, they've got that right back to about 1600 as well. I think even longer. Now, when you look at the series, you see this flat line. Okay? And then we get to the stage where where government spending as a percentage of GDP rises dramatically. And just to give people an idea, the average level of government spending as a percentage of GDP in America before 1945 was 3% of GDP. It's now 10 times that. But when it was very low, flatline prices, nothing much happening, and then bang, this huge increase in the price level. And so that looks like government causes inflation. But if you break the data down and take a look at that pre-1945 numbers, what you see is bigger rates of inflation than we experience now. The difference is they were followed by equally deep deflationary periods. And people who want to get rid of the government and stop government creating inflation, yada, 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 be careful what you wish for because you might get deflation out of that. So, and sometimes in the 1800s, the rate of inflation was 25% in 1 year. And the next year it was minus 30. Now, what that means is booming economic activity. Everybody's happy as Larry. Great things are happening. The next year, prices fall by 30%. You're bankrupt. You're on the street.
Well, it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of reasoning to work that out, does it? Really, if you've got a static money supply, but you're producing more stuff, you're producing more stuff, you've got less money to buy it, then people have got to drop their prices to sell the same amount of stuff,
which they can't do if they've got debt because they've got to service their debt. So all these things are, this is why the neoclassicals talk about general equilibrium. My work is general dynamics. Put the whole damn thing together, see what the interacting dynamics are, and then you can make some sensible statements. Otherwise, you're being a fool who thinks you can have constant, why not changing with respect to time, and that is just, the static mindset of neoclassicals leads them massively astray.
So back to our fundamental question today, then, which is, how do you get yourself out of a downturn in spending? And it is that balancing act, isn't it, between the government creating more money and people borrowing more. And there's an issue with both of them. If the government goes too crazy with spending money and puts too much money into the economy, then you do get an inflationary impact.
You can,
and if people,
not directly.
Just finishing my point. You're interrupting me, Steve. Can you stop interrupting me? And then it's just saying it's a balancing act between what the government does and then what the private sector does, because if the private sector borrows too much, they can't service that debt. So it is finding the even balance between all of these things. It's the rate of change as well, rather than looking at it in absolute terms, that you've got to look at.
That's right. Forget about Y, it's dy/dt, rate of change of our output with respect to time. That's what we should be looking at. Everything should be thought in dynamic terms. And half of the nonsense that neoclassical economists come up with, and Austrians as well, is by fundamentally thinking they can work in equilibrium terms and handle a dynamic system. You can't.
Yeah, but we're saved in a way, aren't we? Because even at times like this, where you've got government saying, "Oh, we've got to pay back the money that we borrowed through because of the deficit that we created during
Mm.
COVID," they are incapable of doing that because they can't
Yeah,
make the cut. So the only way we're ever going to actually see the money supply decrease, as far as the government's concerned, is if all of a sudden the government starts to run a huge surplus, and they never do that. So actually what we're talking about is the government is always creating money, always adding to the money supply. It's just the speed at which they're adding to the money supply, which is determined by how big the deficit is that year.
yeah. I mean, they have the only period in America's history where there was a sustained government surplus, so government taxation exceeding spending, and therefore they were paying, retiring their bonds. That was in the 1920s. And then we had the 1930s, and the 1920s caused the 1930s. And you can see it in the empirical data, obvious as a dog's balls. But neoclassicals don't believe in sex, so they can never see it, not even on a dog. God, I'm getting in a bad mood, aren't I?
I think we should leave it there.
I think so.
There we are.
Leave it hanging.
It's been a fascinating half hour or so,
Bad analogies. Yeah,
with deep of bad analogies, but deep respect
absolutely.
and respect for the viewer as well. Look at us, both of us in collared shirts. You've even put a
Hmm.
jacket on. I mean, the standards are raising so much, aren't they?
I know
On
there'll be
on
a
this
bow tie
podcast.
next week. I'll see if I can
Yeah.
find one.
Most of our audience, by the way, I think, what are they going on about? Because they're listening to the audio version of this. But we are on YouTube as well. Should you, I
Yeah,
wouldn't
please turn
recommend
up
it
and look at us
necessarily.
because we're extremely ugly and it'll make you feel better about yourself.
You'll be straight back to the audio only version in a flash. That's it for this week. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you next week.
Good on.